The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the dense forest canopy when an experienced hunter stepped out of his old pickup truck. He'd been hunting in these woods for over 30 years, ever since his father first taught him how to track deer through the wilderness. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he adjusted the worn leather strap of his rifle case over his shoulder. The hunter knew these Montana forests like the back of his hand, or at least, that's what he thought until that peculiar morning. Everything started normally enough. He followed his usual trail, the one that wound past the cluster of young birch trees and down into the valley where deer often grazed in the early morning hours. The leaves crunched softly beneath his boots as he moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent countless hours in the wilderness. He paused occasionally, listening to the forest's morning symphony, birds calling to each other, squirrels rustling through the branches above, and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. But something felt different that day. There was an unusual stillness in the air, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Even the birds seemed to have hushed their morning songs. The hunter had learned long ago to trust his instincts in the woods. They'd saved him from more than one close encounter with angry bears and treacherous weather. As he ventured deeper into the forest, moving away from his familiar hunting spots, he noticed the trees getting older and larger. Their trunks were thick with age, their bark deeply furrowed and covered with patches of bright green moss. The forest floor here was carpeted with ferns that seemed to glow in the filtered morning light. That's when he saw it, an enormous oak tree that somehow he'd never noticed before. It stood apart from the others, its massive trunk easily twice the size of any tree he'd seen in these woods. But it wasn't just the size that caught his attention. There was something else, something that made him stop in his tracks and lower his rifle. Strange markings covered one side of the ancient oak's trunk. At first glance, they looked like they might have been made by bears clawing at the bark, but as he got closer, he realized these were different. The patterns were too regular, too intentional. They formed intricate swirls and lines that seemed to shift and change as he walked around the tree, like they were trying to tell him something. The hunter had seen plenty of carved initials and trail markers in his time, but these were unlike anything he'd encountered. They appeared old, very old, with edges softened by decades or perhaps centuries of weather. Yet they also seemed somehow fresh, as if they'd been carved yesterday. When he reached out to touch them, he could have sworn he felt a slight warmth radiating from the bark, despite the cool morning air. As he traced one of the patterns with his finger, a strange sensation traveled up his arm, like a gentle electric current mixed with the feeling you get when you're about to discover something important. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, and the early morning light took on an unusual quality, making the dewdrops on nearby ferns sparkle like tiny stars. The hunter had always considered himself a practical man. He dealt in the solid realities of tracking, weather patterns, and animal behavior. But standing there, beside that ancient oak with its mysterious markings, he felt something shift in his understanding of the world. It was as if a veil he hadn't even known existed was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of something both wonderful and slightly terrifying. He took a step back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and feeling. That's when he noticed something else. The ground around the tree was different. While the surrounding forest floor was covered in the usual scatter of leaves and twigs, the earth immediately around the oak was unusually bare and smooth, forming a perfect circle around the massive trunk. As he stood there, lost in thought, the morning silence was broken by the snap of a twig somewhere behind him. The hunter turned quickly, his years of experience automatically making him reach for his rifle. But what he saw next would challenge everything he thought he knew about these woods and about the world itself. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of an adventure that would change not only his life, but his entire understanding of the forest he thought he knew so well. The ancient oak with its mysterious markings was about to reveal secrets that had been waiting centuries to be discovered, and the hunter would soon learn that some things in these woods were far more extraordinary than any story he'd ever heard. The snap of the twig made the hunter's heart skip a beat. His hands tightened instinctively on his rifle as he turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a bear. But what emerged from behind a cluster of ferns stopped him dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. A dog stood there, but calling it just a dog felt like calling a mountain just a hill. It was larger than any dog he'd ever seen, with fur as black as a moonless night that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. But it was the eyes that truly captured his attention. They were an extraordinary silver color, like moonlight on water, and they held an intelligence that made the hunter's skin prickle with goosebumps. The dog didn't move like a normal animal either. There was a deliberate grace to its movements as it stepped forward, each paw placed with careful precision on the forest floor. It showed no fear, no aggression, just a calm awareness that seemed almost human. The hunter had encountered plenty of wild animals and hunting dogs in his years in the woods, but this was something entirely different. "Hello there," he found himself saying, his voice sounding strange in the unusually quiet forest. To his amazement, the dog's head tilted slightly, as if it was actually considering his greeting. Then something even more extraordinary happened. The dog looked deliberately at the ancient oak tree, then back at the hunter, then again at the tree. The motion was so clearly intentional that the hunter felt a shiver run down his spine. Following the dog's gaze, he noticed something he'd missed before. The mysterious markings on the tree seemed to be glowing faintly, pulsing with a subtle light that shouldn't have been possible. He blinked hard, thinking his eyes must be playing tricks on him, but the gentle illumination remained. The black dog moved closer to the tree, and the hunter noticed that its feet made absolutely no sound on the leaf-covered ground. It stopped next to the trunk and raised one paw, placing it against the bark near one of the glowing patterns. The hunter could have sworn he saw a spark of silver light pass between the dog's paw and the tree. His practical mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe this was someone's trained dog that had gotten lost in the woods. But deep down, he knew that explanation didn't fit what he was witnessing. Everything about this animal suggested it belonged here, right next to this ancient oak, as if it was part of whatever mystery the tree held. The dog turned those remarkable silver eyes back to him, and for a moment, the hunter felt like he was being evaluated, measured in some way he couldn't understand. There was wisdom in that gaze, ancient and deep, like looking into the eyes of someone who had seen centuries pass by. It made him feel both small and somehow chosen at the same time. Then the dog did something that challenged everything the hunter thought he knew about animals. It deliberately walked to one side of the tree and pawed at a specific spot on the trunk, looking back at him expectantly. When he didn't move immediately, it repeated the action, this time with an almost human-like gesture of impatience. The hunter found himself moving forward, drawn by a curiosity that overrode his natural caution. As he got closer, he noticed that the dog's fur wasn't just black, it seemed to shift and shimmer with subtle patterns, like the northern lights in a night sky. The air around the animal felt different too, charged with a kind of energy he'd never experienced before. Reaching the spot the dog had indicated, he saw what looked like a perfectly natural formation in the tree's bark. But when he ran his fingers over it, following the dog's intent gaze, he felt something shift beneath his touch. The bark seemed to ripple under his fingers, and he could have sworn he heard a faint humming sound coming from within the tree itself. The dog watched him intently, its silver eyes reflecting something that looked almost like approval. Whatever was happening here, whatever this mysterious animal was trying to show him, the hunter realized he had stumbled onto something far beyond his understanding of the natural world. As he stood there, his hand still resting on the ancient oak's bark, the dog moved to sit beside him. Its presence felt both reassuring and slightly unnerving, like having a wise but mysterious guide who knew far more than they were telling. The morning sun had risen higher now, but the forest remained unusually quiet, as if the whole woods were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Little did the hunter know, this extraordinary encounter was just the beginning. The mysterious dog and the ancient oak tree were about to reveal secrets that would transform his understanding of not just these woods, but of reality itself. And somewhere, deep within the tree, something was stirring, awakening after a very long sleep. The hunter's fingers trembled slightly as they explored the spot where the mysterious dog had indicated. The bark felt warm beneath his touch, almost alive, and with each careful movement, he could feel subtle ridges and patterns that didn't seem natural. The black dog sat patiently beside him, those silver eyes watching his every move with what seemed like anticipation. Suddenly, under the pressure of his exploring fingers, something clicked. It wasn't a loud sound, more like the gentle settling of old wood, but in the quiet forest it seemed to echo. A section of the bark, perfectly camouflaged until now, shifted slightly inward. The hunter held his breath as he carefully pressed against it, and to his amazement, a hidden cavity within the massive oak trunk was revealed. The opening wasn't large, maybe the size of a small shoebox, but it was clearly man-made. The edges were smooth, worn by time but deliberately carved. Inside, protected from decades of weather, sat a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked with age, but still intact, preserved by whatever magic this ancient tree possessed. As he carefully lifted it out, a few dried leaves fell from its pages, dancing in the morning light before settling on the forest floor. The dog moved closer, its mysterious presence lending an almost ceremonial feeling to the moment. When the hunter opened the journal, the leather creaked softly, and the scent of old paper and ink filled the air. The handwriting on the first page was faded but still legible, written in an elegant style that spoke of another era. The date at the top of the page made his heart skip a beat, September 15, 1892. But it was the name below the date that truly shocked him. He recognized it immediately. It was his great-grandfather's name, written in the same distinctive style he'd seen on old family documents his grandmother had shown him when he was young. He'd grown up hearing stories about his great-grandfather, a respected woodsman who had mysteriously disappeared in these very forests, leaving behind a young family and countless unanswered questions. The dog's tail swept once across the forest floor, creating a soft swishing sound that brought the hunter back to the present moment. With hands that shook slightly, he began to read the first entry. "I have finally found it, the heart tree. After years of searching, following the signs and markers left by those who came before, I stand before an oak that defies ordinary explanation. The markings match exactly those in the old drawings, though they seem to shift and change when I look away, as if they have a life of their own. I know now that all the stories I dismissed as mere folklore contain more truth than I ever imagined." The hunter had to pause, his mind reeling. The oak tree his great-grandfather wrote about, could it be the same one he was standing beside now? He glanced at the mysterious markings on the trunk, which still seemed to pulse with that faint, impossible light. The black dog pressed closer to his side, its warm presence somehow reassuring as he continued reading. The journal entries that followed told an extraordinary tale. His great-grandfather wrote about discovering an ancient society that had lived in harmony with the forest, people who understood secrets about nature that modern science was only beginning to grasp. They had learned to communicate with special guardian creatures, beings that could take the form of dogs, but were something far more ancient and powerful. As he turned page after page, the hunter's understanding of his family history, and of these woods, began to transform. His great-grandfather described how he learned that certain trees, like this ancient oak, served as doorways or bridges between the ordinary world and something else, something deeper and more mysterious. These trees were sacred sites, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The dog's silver eyes never left the journal as the hunter read, as if it knew exactly what secrets these pages contained. Sometimes, when he reached particularly important passages, the mysterious animal would make a soft sound, almost like a hum, drawing his attention to specific words or descriptions. One passage made him stop and read it twice. "The guardian has shown me things I never dreamed possible. There are patterns and connections in these woods that most people never see, lines of energy that flow between the trees like rivers of light. The ancient ones knew how to work with these forces, how to maintain the balance that keeps both worlds healthy. But their knowledge is being lost, and the guardians grow fewer with each passing generation." The hunter looked at the black dog beside him with new understanding. Could this be one of the guardians his great-grandfather wrote about? The animal met his gaze steadily, those silver eyes seeming to confirm his suspicions. But this raised even more questions. Why had it chosen to reveal itself to him? And what had really happened to his great-grandfather? The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, but time seemed to have lost its normal meaning in this extraordinary moment. As he carefully turned another page of the journal, the hunter realized that his life would never be quite the same after today. The mysteries his great-grandfather had uncovered were now being passed to him, and somehow he knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. Sitting down on a fallen log near the ancient oak, the hunter continued reading his great-grandfather's journal, the mysterious black dog settling quietly at his feet. Each page revealed more about the hidden world that had existed alongside the one he thought he knew so well. The morning dew had dried on the forest floor, and shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns that seemed more meaningful now than ever before. His great-grandfather's handwriting grew more excited as the journal entries progressed, describing incredible discoveries about the ancient society that once lived in these woods. They weren't just simple forest dwellers, they were keepers of profound knowledge, understanding things about nature that modern science was only beginning to grasp. These people, one entry read, could read the forest like we read a book. They knew that every tree, every plant, every animal was connected in ways we can barely imagine. The guardian creatures, these remarkable beings that can take the form of dogs, were their partners in maintaining the balance of this place. They could see the energy that flows through everything, the life force that connects all living things. The black dog's ears perked up at these words, and when the hunter glanced down, those silver eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. He found himself wondering how old this creature really was. Had it known his great-grandfather? Had it been watching over these woods all this time? The journal described how these ancient people had created special sites throughout the forest, places where the natural energy was strongest. The ancient oak tree he sat beside was one of these sites, a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and something more mysterious grew thin. His great-grandfather had drawn detailed maps of these locations, marking them with symbols that matched the strange markings on the tree. The Guardians showed me how these sites form a network, another entry explained. It's like a web of invisible threads connecting different parts of the forest. When I learned to quiet my mind and really look, I could actually see these connections, like streams of light flowing between the trees. The ancient ones used these energy lines to keep the forest healthy and balanced. As he read on, the hunter began to understand why his great-grandfather had disappeared. He hadn't been lost or met with an accident as everyone had assumed. He had made a choice to become part of something larger than himself. The Guardians have offered me a remarkable opportunity, one of the final entries read. They say I have shown the right spirit, the right understanding of what these woods truly are. They've asked me to join them in their work, to become one of the new protectors of these ancient ways. Few people are chosen for this honor, they tell me, but it means leaving behind everything I know, everyone I love. The choice weighs heavy on my heart. The hunter paused in his reading, his throat tight with emotion. He had grown up wondering about the grandfather he never knew, imagining all sorts of tragic endings to his story. But now he was learning that his great-grandfather had found something extraordinary, something that had called to him so strongly he'd chosen to leave his old life behind. Looking down at the mysterious dog, he saw that it was watching him with what seemed like deep understanding. The creature's presence felt different now that he knew what it truly was, not just a dog, but one of these ancient guardians his great-grandfather had written about. A being that had probably walked these woods for centuries, watching the seasons change, keeping secrets that most people would never know existed. The journal's final pages revealed more about the Guardians themselves. They were ancient beings who had watched over these woods since before humans first walked among the trees. They could take different forms, but preferred the shape of dogs because it allowed them to interact with humans without causing fear. They were neither fully of this world nor completely separate from it. They existed in between, helping to maintain the balance between the seen and unseen realms. As the hunter read, the forest around him seemed to come alive in new ways. The breeze moving through the leaves sounded almost like whispers, and he could swear he saw faint glimmers of light moving between the trees, perhaps glimpses of the energy lines his great-grandfather had described. The woods he thought he knew so well were revealing themselves to be so much more than he had ever imagined. The last entry in the journal was brief but powerful. Tomorrow I begin my new life as a guardian of these woods. To those who might find this journal, know that there is more to this world than what your eyes can see. The ancient ways are not lost, just hidden, waiting for those with the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to embrace them. The forest is alive in ways you never dreamed possible, and the Guardians are still here, watching, protecting, waiting for the right people to share their secrets with. The hunter closed the journal carefully, his mind spinning with everything he had learned. The black dog stood up, stretching in a way that seemed deliberately casual, but those silver eyes held a question. The hunter had a feeling he knew what choice lay ahead of him, and why this guardian had chosen today to reveal itself. Little did he know, his great-grandfather's story was about to become intertwined with his own in ways he never could have imagined. As the hunter carefully tucked his great-grandfather's journal into his jacket pocket, the black dog rose to its feet. The morning had grown warmer, but there was still a mysterious chill in the air around the ancient oak. Looking into those silver eyes, the hunter knew that everything was about to change. The guardian dog took a few steps toward the massive tree, then turned to face him. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The air around the creature began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The dog's form seemed to blur and shift, and while it still maintained its basic shape, it now appeared to be made partly of shadow and partly of light. Those silver eyes grew brighter, looking more like stars than anything earthly. Without using words, but somehow communicating clearly in the hunter's mind, the guardian began to share its story. Images and feelings flowed into his thoughts, showing him the history of these woods in a way no book ever could. He saw the ancient people who first discovered the power in these forests, watched them learn to work with the guardians to protect the balance of nature. He witnessed centuries pass like flowing water, saw how the modern world had slowly forgotten these old ways. The guardian showed him how the network of sacred sites throughout the forest had grown weaker over time, as fewer people remembered the old knowledge. The ancient oak trees that served as doorways between worlds were becoming rare, and with each one that was lost, a little more magic faded from the world. The guardians themselves were growing fewer, their numbers dwindling as they struggled to find worthy humans to join their ranks. Then the vision shifted, and the hunter saw his great-grandfather as a young man, standing in this very spot. He watched as another guardian, different but similar to the one before him now, offered the same choice his great-grandfather had written about in his journal. He felt his great-grandfather's mix of excitement and fear, understood the weight of the decision he had faced. The vision faded, and the hunter found himself back in the present moment. The guardian dog sat before him, its form still shimmering with that otherworldly light. In his mind, he had a question, not in words exactly, but in feelings and images. Would he be willing to follow in his great-grandfather's footsteps? Would he choose to become a new guardian of these ancient ways? The weight of the decision pressed on him. He thought about his life, his small cabin on the edge of town, his routine of hunting and tracking, the simple pleasures he'd always known. But he also thought about how empty it sometimes felt, how he'd always sensed there was something more, something deeper calling to him from these woods. The guardian showed him what his choice would mean. If he accepted, he would learn to see the world in entirely new ways. He would learn to perceive the threads of energy that connected all living things, understand the deep mysteries his great-grandfather had written about. He would become part of an ancient tradition, helping to protect and preserve the magic that still lived in these forests. But there would be a price. Like his great-grandfather, he would have to leave his old life behind. The guardian made it clear, this wasn't a part-time role. To become a true guardian meant dedicating yourself completely to the forest and its mysteries. He would have to give up hunting, give up his normal life, and step into a world few humans ever got to see. As he stood there, considering the choice before him, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The ancient oak's markings glowed more brightly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Leaves rustled overhead without any wind, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. Though the hunter knew now it might not be a normal wolf at all. He thought about his great-grandfather's journal, about the wonder and excitement in those written words. He thought about all the times he'd felt something special in these woods, all the moments when he'd sensed there was more to the forest than what his eyes could see. Now he understood those feelings. They had been preparing him for this moment, this choice. The guardian waited patiently, its silver eyes filled with ancient wisdom. The hunter could feel the weight of centuries in that gaze, the accumulated knowledge of countless seasons spent watching over these woods. This was a turning point, not just in his life, but in the ongoing story of these forests and their guardians. In his heart, he knew what his answer would be. Just like his great-grandfather before him, he felt the pull of something larger than himself, something more meaningful than the life he'd known. The forest had always been his true home. Now he had the chance to understand it in ways he never dreamed possible. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows through the leaves overhead. As the hunter prepared to give his answer, he felt a deep sense of rightness, as if his entire life had been leading to this moment. Whatever came next would change everything, but sometimes, he realized, change was exactly what the heart needed most. The hunter took a deep breath and nodded, accepting the guardian's offer. In that moment, the forest around him seemed to come alive with light. The ancient oak's markings blazed like starfire, and the air itself appeared to shimmer with threads of silver and gold. The black dog's form grew brighter, its silver eyes radiating a gentle warmth that wrapped around the hunter like a comfortable blanket. What happened next was unlike anything he could have imagined. The guardian began to share its knowledge, not through words or even clear images, but through a kind of direct understanding that flowed into his mind like water. It was overwhelming at first, centuries of wisdom pouring into his consciousness, showing him how to see the world in entirely new ways. He learned to perceive the energy lines that his great-grandfather had written about. At first, they appeared as faint glimmers in the corner of his eye, like spider webs catching the morning light. But as the guardian taught him to focus his attention properly, these lines became clearer. They flowed between trees like rivers of light, connecting everything in the forest in a vast, living network. The guardian showed him how to quiet his mind and listen to the forest in a deeper way. Sounds he'd always taken for granted, the rustle of leaves, the cry of a distant bird, the bubble of a stream, began to carry messages he'd never noticed before. He learned that the forest was constantly communicating, sharing information about weather changes, danger, food sources, and countless other things. His hands tingled as he learned to touch the energy flows, guided by the guardian's patient teaching. It was like learning a new language, but instead of words, he was learning to understand the very pulse of life that ran through the woods. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of other guardians in the distance, shadowy forms that might look like wolves, deer, or birds to ordinary eyes, but which he now recognized as his new kin. The transformation wasn't just about learning new skills, it was changing him from the inside out. The rifle he carried all morning now felt strange in his hands, and he gently set it aside. The urge to hunt had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the forest's balance. He saw now that every creature played its part in maintaining the health of these woods, and his role was no longer to take life, but to protect it. The guardian led him to other ancient oaks scattered throughout the forest, teaching him how these special trees served as anchors for the energy that flowed through the woods. He learned to recognize the signs and symbols carved into their bark, not just seeing them with his eyes, but understanding their meaning with his heart. Each marking told a story, preserved knowledge from the ancient ones who had first learned to work with the guardians. As the day wore on, his awareness continued to expand. He began to sense the different layers of reality that existed in the forest. The physical world he'd always known was just the surface. Beneath it lay deeper currents of energy and life that he'd never imagined. He could feel the seasons turning in the earth beneath his feet, sense the memories stored in ancient trees, and even catch glimpses of other guardians moving between these layers of reality. The learning wasn't always easy. Sometimes the new awareness overwhelmed him, making his head spin with too much information. But the guardian was patient, teaching him how to control his expanding senses, how to filter out what wasn't important and focus on what needed his attention. It was like learning to see, hear, and feel all over again, but with senses he never knew he had. He discovered that every living thing in the forest had its own kind of consciousness, its own way of being aware. Even the smallest plants had a kind of intelligence, a way of responding to the world around them that was far more complex than he'd ever realized. The guardian showed him how to communicate with different beings, each in their own way, not with words, but with energy and intention. As the afternoon light began to fade, the hunter realized he wasn't really a hunter anymore. That life seemed distant now, like a dream he'd awakened from. In its place was a new understanding of his true purpose. He was becoming a guardian himself, taking his place in an ancient tradition that stretched back to the very beginning of these woods. The black dog, his teacher and guide, showed him one final thing before the day ended. Leading him back to the ancient oak where their journey had begun, the guardian helped him see how to use the tree's energy to strengthen the forest's protective barriers. As he placed his hands on the rough bark, he could feel the power flowing through the tree, and for the first time, he knew how to work with it, how to help maintain the balance that kept these woods healthy and whole. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. but the forest glowed with its own inner light, a luminescence that he could now see clearly. The guardian dog sat beside him, those silver eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight, and in his heart, the hunter, now guardian, knew that his life's true purpose had finally begun. 1 year had passed since that life-changing morning in the forest. The former hunter, now a full guardian of the woods, walked silently among the trees with his constant companion, the black dog with silver eyes, who had first shown him this hidden world. The morning air was crisp with autumn's bite, just like it had been on that fateful day, but now he experienced it in ways his old self never could have imagined. Where he once would have been looking for deer tracks or listening for turkey calls, he now perceived the countless threads of energy that connected everything in the forest. They shimmered like dewdrops in spider webs, linking tree to tree, earth to sky, past to present. His awareness had expanded far beyond what he'd thought possible, and yet he knew he was still learning, still growing into his role as a guardian. He'd left his old life behind, just as his great-grandfather had done. His hunting rifle now gathered dust in a corner of his cabin, a reminder of who he used to be. These days he carried something far more powerful, the ancient knowledge passed down through generations of guardians, and the ability to see and work with the forest's living energy. Local hunters sometimes spotted him walking through the woods with his mysterious black dog. They would wave or nod, remembering him from his previous life, but something about his presence now made them pause. There was a quietness about him, a sense of something ancient and powerful that made even the most hardened woodsman speak in whispers when he passed by. Stories began to circulate in the nearby town. People talked about strange lights seen deep in the forest at night, about the way the woods seemed healthier and more vibrant than anyone could remember. They spoke of a man who walked with a black dog who appeared just when he was needed, warning hikers away from dangerous areas, finding lost children, somehow knowing exactly where to be. As he stood now beside the ancient oak where his journey had begun, watching the morning sun filter through the leaves, he felt a deep sense of peace. The markings on the tree still glowed with their mysterious light, but they were no longer mysterious to him. He could read their meaning as easily as reading a book, understanding the ancient wisdom they contained. His guardian companion pressed against his leg, those silver eyes reflecting the morning light. Together they watched a group of deer pass nearby, the animals sensing their presence but showing no fear. This was his life now, not taking from the forest, but protecting it. Not hunting its creatures, but ensuring they could thrive. Not just walking through the woods, but being truly part of them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, another guardian, calling out to share news of their territory. The black dog's ears perked up, and the former hunter smiled, understanding the message in that call. There was work to be done, as there always was. But now, unlike in his old life, every task had meaning, every action served a greater purpose. He reached down to touch the ancient oak's bark one last time, feeling the pulse of life beneath his fingers. Then he and his companion turned away, walking deeper into the forest they had sworn to protect. The morning sun caught the dog's fur, making it shimmer with that otherworldly light, while the man's footsteps left no trace on the forest floor. They were guardians now, both of them, keeping alive an ancient tradition that would continue long after they were gone. And so the story that began with a hunter finding mysterious markings on a tree had become something far greater, a tale of transformation, of finding one's true purpose, of learning to see the magic that exists in the world if we only know how to look for it. The forest had gained a new protector, the guardians had gained a new brother, and the ancient ways lived on, passing from one generation to the next, as they had since the beginning of time.